Okay, Mr. Chair, we are live.
All right. Thank you, Graham. Good afternoon. We have two portions of our meeting today. One to discuss the request from the superintendent related to a number of items that we've had some previous discussions on in terms of the practicum that we need to respond to. The second would be some further discussions that we may have in closed session. But before we go on to that and further comments from me, I wanted Rachel to give an update on staffing, where we are with that, and any other comments you may want to make reference to that, Rachel. I assume we have a quorum. Okay.
Yes, we have all the members are here. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So very briefly, I just introduced, we have two official employees now to join Graham and myself with the AIB. And that is Rachel Amstutz, who has been the legislative fellow to the AIB since November, and is joining us and will be the Director of Operations and Policy. And she comes to us most recently as a principal in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. And then also Emma Pellerin. Emma is comes to us as a education researcher and a former Baltimore City teacher, and will be the direct implementation plan director. So she's going to have her hands full very quickly.
Well, welcome aboard. We congratulate you. We look for an ongoing collaboration with you, and I'm sure that you're going to add a great deal of value to our discussions and our work as we go forward. So congratulations. As indicated before, there are a number of items that we have to discuss today in the request from the superintendent. Some were asked directly of us, and I think there are a couple of questions that I think were related and comments that we may have about those. There was a draft forwarded to a number of you early in the week, basically a draft outlining some of the general discussions and parameters of the discussion that we were to have today. We have not taken an official vote in response to the superintendent's request. And so today's meeting is designed for us to engage in a discussion before we finalize that response. And we will have that response that will not be ultimately all the I's and T's brought across today, but the general outline of where we stand. And we hopefully will have that available for you as we go forward. But today is the discussion about the broad details of where we stand today. So with that, I'm going to ask Rachel to walk us through the key points of the draft. And at any point in time, you have any questions or you want to wait till the end, we'll do so, and then we'll get a sense of where the board members are before we move forward. Rachel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So essentially, the draft sort of follows the framework, the outline of the conversation from last week's meeting regarding the main issues in the two sets of regulations, the one dealing with educator preparation programs, and the other dealing with education licensure. And so focusing on the issues that the superintendent specifically identified for the AIB to provide consultation on, and then a few other issues that were discussed and came up in the public comments and the public testimony to the AIB last week. So the first issue is related to the length of the teacher practicum. And I think the main set of public comments there obviously had to do with the length of the practicum. And as you know, MSDE, the proposed regulations require the practicum to be 180 days, beginning July 1, 2025, which is the length of the school year in Maryland, although there is a waiver provision for snow and emergencies and things like that. And based on the discussion, the comments received, and then the discussion last week at the meeting, and also some other input that I've in discussions I've had with members over the past week. The draft recommendation is that instead of specifying 180 days in the regulations, that the language really mimic what the statute requires, which is that it be equivalent to a full school year.
Yeah.
So that would be a change to what is currently in the proposed regulations.
Yeah. Let me respond to that just a little bit, because I think the intent was for a full school year, believing that a full school year would equate to 180 days. But if full school year could in fact change, and you do not want a situation whereby you would have someone who misses 180 days, yet continue to work in a practicum for a full school year, because you could have someone who may be in a jurisdiction or place whereby that may have been shortened due to weather or some other emergencies, and the school year was adjusted. So the intent, I think, was to equate that to a full school year, believing that it was 180 days, but it would change associated, it would change depending on how the school year actually developed over that over that academic year. And so that's the initial draft, or at least up for discussion. So why don't we hold at that point, Rachel, and see whether or not there is any response to the interpretation of a full school year that could be 180 days or something short of that, depending on how that school year works out. That is what we believe is the intent, and therefore saying that would in fact be consistent with what the blueprint actually requires us to do.
And let me just say, and then Dr. Stapleton has her hand up. I think instead of specifying 180 days and substituting this language equivalent to a full school year, it does provide some flexibility to the teacher preparation programs and the school systems in terms of how they design the practica so that they are providing the various experiences that students prospective teachers should have throughout the school year, without specifying that it has to be sort of a rigid 180 days, sort of a compliance kind of thing.
Let me also ask another question I failed to address when I was talking earlier.
Mm-hmm.
How was that to be done? Was it consistent in a row consecutively, or there's some flexibility included in that as well?
So there is flexibility. The statute specifically says that they do not need to be consecutive days, and actually encourages different experiences throughout the practicum. And that is also in the regulations.
Right.
So that is specified in the regulations.
All right, there are some questions or comments. Let's hear those.
Yes, I have some comments, and again, I apologize that I was traveling on the last meeting on a Monday, April 25th. So I haven't shared all of this in a forum with all of you, but have talked to some individuals. My opinion is, so anytime there are regulations, there are ways that one can specify what that requirement is that are very easy to measure, and those that are very hard to measure, but perhaps are more accurate or are result in the intention. So I think laying out a 180 days or any specification of number of days is a really easy thing to write down, and is a really easy thing to measure. But I don't think that that's at all going to get at whether a student was exposed to a quality experience and the training that they need. So I strongly, Rachel encapsulated some of my thoughts, and that is, if the intention is for a student to be exposed to the experiences that one would typically get if they were in a school for a school year, then we need to do the hard work, or MSDE and this work group that was specified in the blueprint needs to do the hard work of defining what are those quality experiences. It could be onboarding. It could be experiencing an IEP session and the follow-up issues when a student has an IEP. You know, just being in a school for 180 days or for a school year does not require or does not require in a student having to have an IEP. They may not have a student in their classroom that has an IEP, or they may not have a student in their classroom who's an English as a second language student. And those experiences are key experiences, and a good practicum would make sure that a student gets exposed to those things. So I think we should do the hard work and identify what the components of a practicum would be. So I can talk
What is
more
it
about
that,
that.
what is it that they obtain now in 100 days?
Well, it all depends on the program. So the programs have a lot of flexibility in defining these. It could be, 100 days all in 4 specific months. So they never experience, maybe 5 months. So they don't experience the onboarding part. Or so it could
Well,
be.
how would that change if you simply increase the number of days? That I don't think that was suggested to be changed, would it?
I'm
In other
not
words,
sure.
whatever the experience, let me back up. Whatever the experiences they have now in 100 days, that in whatever requirements that they are to meet now in 100 days,
Mhm.
the length of time does not necessarily eliminate those things, does it?
I'm not sure I totally understand your question. I'm not arguing for 100 days either.
No, I'm
I-
saying
right.
what I was trying to get at, whatever they are doing now currently
Mhm.
within the current requirements, if you extend the number of days, i.e. a full school year, I don't believe that the legislation suggests that those things be changed. So it's simply an extension of that with the parameters that we've just described. You don't have to be consistent. There may be some other things that they would do, but I don't see that will substantially change from what they're currently doing.
If I can jump in here. So
Mhm.
I think right now, the 100-day requirement doesn't address the different experiences and different school settings that we want teachers to be exposed to while they're in their preparation program, so that when they actually do go into a classroom as a teacher, they've had these different experiences. And that is why the commission recommended moving to a full school year. And the blueprint law, requires it. And so I think identifying the different types of experiences and different school settings that the practicum should include would be very consistent with what the commission intended, what the law intends. And I actually neglected to say that part of the recommendation is that the regulations should incorporate the skills and the experiences that we want students to have, the skills that they should acquire as part of the practicum. So that would be part of the recommendation. So I think that it's not 100% what Dr. Stapleton is talking about, but
It's close. I just think if any time that the metric that they're going to evaluate is so far from what you actually want to happen, that you allow for all these possible program creations that aren't what's intended. And so yes, days is very easy to measure and reflects a full school year as one definition of a school year, but it's the experiences of the school year, I think, that we're really interested in.
Let me ask a question about that, because I assume that whatever those experiences are within the various boards around the state, that they would incorporate those things, because there may be experiences that you cannot reasonably codify today. In other words, if we were to list all of the things that we believe that they should do, I am sure that school A or school B would say, well, we need to also include X and Y and Z in that. But because it is not codified, when you specify it so clearly, what is not specified could in fact be interpreted that's not meaningful, as opposed to saying, here are the general things that we expect you to do. And you are then in a parameter for which you can make those decisions locally on the ground. But if you go down the list, and that's the challenge when you codify things too narrowly, you're going to always leave things out, or things will change, and those changes are not reflected in what you codify, and therefore the interpretation is they were not meant to be included, as opposed to here are general parameters of what we think you should do, but you have to incorporate those at the local level.
I think you're right. I think we need a balance is needed.
Yeah. But does the inclusion of what Rachel talked about address fully what you raised?
I think it depends on the work of this work group.
Okay. All right.
Rachel,
Any other question? Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Kerwin?
hand up. Yeah, I actually think, I think Laura makes a very good point that, and I'm hopeful that the language Rachel read addresses it, that it does seem incumbent upon MSDE group or whoever's going to further refine this to describe the elements that would make for a successful induction program. So, Rachel, from what you read, isn't that sort of include or implied or maybe explicitly stated in our response?
Yeah, so I'll just read what it says right now. It says, the AIB further recommends that the experiences and skills that undergraduate teacher candidates should receive over the course of the practicum should be specified in the regulations.
That seemed,
And then I think, and Dr. Stapleton, correct me if I'm wrong, were you suggesting, we haven't gotten to this yet, but we talked about it at the last meeting, asking this work group of the MSDE and MHEC and the teacher preparation programs to convene and work on things. Were you suggesting that group also be asked to provide some input on what the skills and experiences should be?
I think they should, and also just react to any sort of list, because there may be very good reasons why something would be unable to be implemented without additional resources or something. So at least, that implementation feasibility piece should be at least discussed. And Britt, I just wanted to mention one thing. You mentioned induction. And typically that term's used for first-year students.
I'm
first-year
sorry,
teachers.
I
No, it's
used
okay. I
wrong
just
term.
wanted to make sure for the role.
I'm sorry, I didn't know. It's
Let me
the right word. Isn't it?
let me go back just to be clear what we're talking about here. I am fine with whatever refinements we need to make to provide the guardrails and the kinds of experiences generally that we're talking about. But this should be clear that what the legislation is requiring in terms of the number of days is not something that is further renegotiated in those experiences. And so long as we are clear about that, I'm fine. But if refinements mean we can reduce the number of days as opposed to we have the number of days, but we may look at some experiences consistent with what the work group may work out, that's fine. But if refinement means we actually reduce the number of days that's called for in the regulation, then I have a question about that.
There's no days mentioned in the regulation. It
says a
says
full school year.
equivalent to a full school year.
No,
Why
but
isn't
it's
that equivalent experiences of a full school year? I have to tell you, there's certain days in school where people are not learning much.
Yeah,
I mean,
I understand that, but what the superintendent is suggesting, at least not superintendent, but the board is suggesting here is 180 days. We are suggesting a change to that as I see it. Is that correct, Rachel?
Yes.
Yes, which
Yeah.
would be equivalent to a full school year. So
Yeah.
we're saying it doesn't have to be exactly 180 days, but it certainly has to be more than 100 days. And then we're further suggesting that the types of experiences and skills that should be part of this new practicum, I'm going to call it, it would be good to specify what those are so that, to Dr. Stapleton's point, just adding days does not mean that you're actually getting at what the blueprint really was trying to get at, which is that it's a high quality experience
Right.
that really
Understand.
prepares teachers.
Yeah, but I just want to make sure that we are clear. Our recommendation is to not go with the precise 180 days as originally drafted, but provide a full school year, which provides more flexibility and even greater flexibility in terms of how you use that 180 days based on the additional language that Dr. Stapleton is talking about, correct?
The full school year,
So,
we'll say.
full school year, greater flexibility there,
Yeah.
and then greater flexibility with the various things and how you count that within that time, with how you evaluate that within that school year. So there are 2 points of change there, from 180 to a full year, to how you equate the experiences within that year. So there's flexibility on 2 points there.
Yes,
Are
exactly.
we clear about that, everyone? In terms
I
of
do
what?
see Mr.
what would you-
Harris's hand up. I'm not sure if it's on this point.
It
Sure.
is on this point, and then I have a follow-up point. So on this point, maybe I'm just a simpleton, but how does this equivalency thing work? Like, who's assessing this? And like, just assume like a layman is tuning into this, because I am not in enough education. So like, we went from something very precise, 180 days, which, okay, that makes sense, to, or the equivalent of a full school year. So like, who's deciding that, and what's the process by which? And like, you said it's not necessarily 180 days. Like, what's the range? Like, are we talking like 140 to 180, 160 to 180? Just like unpack this so that it's legible.
Those are very good questions. So I think that by moving from the, very clear 180 to more flexible language, it also means that the regulations are going to need to provide some process for how MSDE and PSTEB, presumably, who are both responsible for educator preparation programs, how they're implementing the regulations, and the AIB would also be following that, monitoring that, and some criteria for what it means that you've met the equivalent to a full school year. And I think I see Dr. Stapleton might have some thoughts, and Dr.
Yeah,
Herman's
sorry, I
hand.
can't figure out how to quickly put my little hand. I should just put my hand up. I just want to say, currently, Megan, there's a process by which MSDE, anytime a student wants to go through our program and be certified, they have to know that the courses that they've taken from us are appropriate. So there's a system by which MSDE reviews our curriculum. They review our courses, our curriculum, our syllabi for these courses, and stamps them. So there would be a similar process, I would imagine, that would look at what we propose our practicum curriculum would be, and that they would check off that, yes, it has this component, this component, this component.
Okay.
I think one thing, Fagan, is that that there was talk both on the commission, I think maybe we've had it here as well, that you wouldn't, the practicum would not necessarily be entirely in one school year. So you might have parts of it when you were a sophomore, parts of it when you were a junior, but the sum total would be the equivalent of a school year. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's one way to think.
No, it
of it.
makes sense. So just to make the implicit explicit, what we're saying is that rigorously regulating the dosage of the practicum by saying 180 days straight in a classroom, that's what needs to happen, is probably not that smart. And that instead people are getting practicum experience as they go. And as long as that's been vetted, it should add up to count towards having
A school
sufficient
year.
time with practicum.
Yeah.
Cool.
A full school year.
Right. That makes
Yeah.
sense. But I think then to Dr. Stapleton's initial point, I do think we need to have a point of view, not necessarily today, but when this all kind of comes down the pike, we do need to have a point of view of the quality then of those experiences. Otherwise, it feels like we're just devolving all of it, right? Like, because we're saying like, well, you guys can work the quantity out how you want, and you can work the quality out on you want. Just intuitively, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I get that there's a working group and they're going to go work on it and come back and we're going to review it. But in the interim, we should probably have a point of view, at least at the strategies that those practicums need to touch. And so while I agree with you, Ike, that we don't need to do tactics because there's too many to list and that's a rabbit hole, there surely are like buckets of strategies that are vetted, consistent with best practice worldwide that just need to be in evidence, period, full stop.
I think that's what the work group is going to do in the recommendation. To lay out the general things, which here are the parameters which you have to fall within, with a little bit of flexibility here and there, I assume. But I think that's what the work group can work out. And that's the assumption that I'm making, that they will come up with the things that you've just described.
Okay. We should just be ready in case they don't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Any additional comments?
Dr. Lynch.
Dr. Stapleton?
Dr. Lynch.
I'm not sure that it's for us, because I agree with the chair that I think that we want to be careful how much we're actually codifying. But I do think it may be helpful to consider it in terms of hours, internship hours, practicum hours, that could then, instead of days over the course of 4 years. However, I do sort of think that that's something for MSDE and, sort of in implementation phases to be sort of flushed out. Because I think the other thing is what constitutes a day, what's an effective day, that kind of thing.
Okay. Any other comments or question? Okay, well, we'll come up with the general language, carry it over to the work group, and try to specify some parameters consistent with the discussion today. That's our viewpoint, and it will be a full school year without specifying the actual number of days. And we'll come back to you and have that further discussion at a later point. Okay. Let's go to the next question, an issue that was raised, Rachel.
So I think that we've kind of covered the work group as part of this conversation, but very briefly, we're recommending that the work group of the teacher preparation programs be convened, that they would work with MSDE and I get PSTEB actually and MHEC to go through, examine what is currently required of their programs and whether any of the current requirements might no longer be necessary, which would provide a little more room in their curriculum and their program time to incorporate these additional experiences that we're talking about for the practicum. And then also ask them to look at possible implementation models to accomplish this new practicum requirement without increasing costs to students or deterring students from pursuing a teaching degree, because we talked last week that both of those things are adverse impacts that I don't think anyone wants to see. So we're asked, and then we're going to also ask them to specifically either react to or provide a list of the experiences and skills for the practicum. So I had originally suggested that we ask them to do that and report back by September 1st of this year. And the reason I picked that date is because the AIB right now needs to have a draft plan adopted by October 15th. So I wanted to give enough time to kind of vet, to discuss what the work group comes up with. But that is a quick turnaround time.
Really? I'm thinking it's quite a bit of time, because I think most of the things that we were talking about that could be included in there are probably fairly well known. And it may be just some additional things that the experts could look at to debate and discuss what additional should go into that. But if we don't have a reasonable idea of what goes into the experience for a year now, we're in a lot of trouble. There may be some additional things that we want to add to that and evaluate that as appropriately, but we're talking now about 5 months to come up with an answer to those two questions. So I think that time frame is quite adequate.
Dr. Stapleton?
Yeah, I think if it were a time frame during a normal part of the year, but most faculty are on 9-month contracts. And so a lot of people will be on vacation and that sort of thing. I think it probably wouldn't hurt if we could recommend that MSDE also work with the folks who worked with the commission, the consulting, I can't remember the name of it, National Education something.
NCEE?
Yeah, but I think if the goal, I'm just laying out, it's very difficult to schedule anything in the summers because people are not on contract, they're not being paid.
Well, we have to have this ready for our review this fall. And come December, the train has left the station. So if we want to get this to include those additional parameters we think are important, we have to get it done because the train is going to leave with or without those things in there. And what could very well happen is that the state relies back on what their recommendation is, 180 days, with nothing from us. So we're the ones in the crosshairs here if we want to get it done. Because they've already made their recommendation that didn't include this. They just said 180 days.
So maybe there would be sort of a way that staff between NCEE, MSDE, AIB, USM, MICUA, PSTEP, there's a lot of staff who
Community colleges.
Right, thank you, community colleges, yes. Who could pull together, could do, do more of the legwork so that there could be the folks who aren't around some of the summer would be able to, it wouldn't take as much of their time to actually kind of review materials and sort of make decisions essentially, but we can work on that. I mean, obviously they can always ask for an extension if they're not done by September 1st, or provide what they do have by September 1st, and just sort of try to keep the train moving. The next issue, if we're good to move on, was
Yes.
The mentor teacher. There were a lot of comments received about confusion around the use of the term mentor teacher in the regulations, because mentor teacher is sort of it's a generic term that's used in a lot of different settings, not just the teacher practicum, but also the induction programs. And also, there's references to it in the career ladder in professional development. So one recommendation, which comes from the public comments, what is to, come up with a specific term for these mentor teachers in practica, such as a clinical mentor teacher was the suggested term, but whatever they come up with, and define what that is. So that's one recommendation to address some of the confusion around that. And the other concern was around that we talked about was the needing to have these clinical mentor teachers be part of the career ladder and be at the lead teacher level. And that requirement would come in once the AIB itself determines that the career ladder is well established. And so, part of the discussion last week, and it sort of it's part of the recommendation that would go to the board and PSTEB, is that, the AIB is very, aware of the need for enough qualified teachers to be on that level of the career ladder, both in being national board certified, being on that level, that we have a diverse group of teachers, and also that we have that they're spread, they're in all the parts of the state where we need them to be, to staff the practicum programs, and that the AIB, part of your criteria for determining whether the career ladder is well established around the state will be looking at that issue and making sure there are enough qualified clinical mentor teachers to fully staff the practicum all around the state. So that would be part of the recommendation.
Okay.
And then there's just a couple of other provisions in the blueprint law that are not in the proposed regulations, which can certainly be incorporated at a later date, but some of the public comments sort of referred to things that weren't in the regulations. So that includes, a requirement that at some point that the instructional programs and the career ladder be in place in the schools where the practicum programs are taking place, so that teachers are exposed to, the setting in the schools that the blueprint is calling for. And again, that wouldn't be until the career ladder is well established around the state. And then just pointing out that under the blueprint law, MSDE and MHEC are authorized to approve teacher preparation apprenticeship programs that are registered with the Department of Labor, and also the CTE committee that is the Career and Technical Education Committee that's going to be overseeing apprenticeship programs. So just encouraging them to, incorporate that into the regulations at a future date. The next sort of major issue had to deal with the licensure assessment requirements. And the regulations are fairly general right now in terms of when new licensure tests would go into effect, or assessments would take effect for teachers. And so the recommendation is just for the state board and PSTEB to clarify in the regulations sort of the timeline and the process for introducing new tests or assessments for teachers, so that the preparation programs are aware and the students are aware. And there is some of that information is on MSDE's website. And so they've clearly kind of got the timeline sorted out in some of these areas. It's just not part of the regulations yet. And so that would help to make it more clear when these new requirements will come into effect. And then just also pointing out that there were a lot of public comments that were concerned about the potential impact of these new licensure requirements on the diversity of teacher candidates. And while it's not in the regulations and it doesn't need to be in the regulations, I did want everyone to be aware that the blueprint law requires MSDE to actually monitor and assess the impact of the new teacher standards and the assessments for any negative effect on the diversity of teacher candidates and teacher candidates who are passing the initial assessments. And they're required to report those results to the AIB, and the AIB, will certainly be following that very closely to, if there are adverse or negative impacts to, we would want to flag that and look into it more deeply to determine try to see if we can attribute the negative, which piece we can attribute the negative impact to. But I just wanted everyone to be aware of that provision in the law. There also was the issue of the out of area assignment for teachers. And that is not actually in the blueprint law. I think it's certainly, I think based on the comments that were received, there's certainly a lot of concern about how quickly the regulations would require teachers to get this additional certification. It would be basically, if they taught out of area, they would have to be certified in that area by the next school year.
Do we have an assessment of how big a challenge or problem that is? The number of people out of area?
Well, certainly the number of conditional teachers who are licensed this year is, I think it's one of the highest it's ever been in the state. So, and there's I think the pandemic has certainly contributed to that. We've had a lot of teachers who are retiring or just leaving the profession, and that leads to more out of area teachers who receive this conditional licensure.
Yes.
So, the AIB recommendation right now it says that MSBE and PSTEB should consider providing teachers with more time to become certified if they're going to teach in that subject for more than
Gotcha.
a
Understand.
year. And then there also were a few issues that weren't highlighted by the superintendent that came up in the testimony. That included the professional development point. So there's some new provisions around how ongoing professional development, what is required of educators. This is both teachers and administrators. And it's not a recommendation, but it's just sort of a statement that pointing out that under the blueprint law, MSD actually has to establish a new professional development system that is aligned with the blueprint in the career ladder by July 1, 2024. So a couple of years off. And so, it's just assumed that this new professional development point scheme is sort of a transition to whatever new professional development system MSD is going to put forward to align with the blueprint. And then there was also the issue that was raised about creating a licensure pathway for dual enrollment teachers. And we talked about that at the last meeting, and recommending that MSDE work with the school systems and particularly the community colleges to develop a pathway that kind of works in both directions. It would allow college instructors to teach at the high schools, and it would allow the high school teachers to be certified to teach the college courses. So that would be a recommendation. And then the last item just relates to another provision that is not in the regulations currently, which relates to there are a number of new requirements for principals and assistant principals as part of the career ladder and the statute that are not currently, that will need to be incorporated into the licensure and license renewal requirements in the future.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
that covers everything that was in the draft.
Check to see if there are any questions or comments this time.
Just just to bring closure to this, there will be a memo that will
Right.
be sent back. And what's the time?
Reflecting today's conversation.
Yeah, what's the time frame for that?
So my plan would be to revise the draft and recirculate it to all of you for your feedback to me. And then, assuming there aren't any major, substantive changes, then it would reflect this conversation, and we would go ahead and send it to Superintendent Chaudhary. If more significant discussion is required, then we would need to bring it to the next meeting.
Right.
Thank you.
And thank you, Rachel. And thank you for all your hard work and getting us to this point. And for all the comments that we've had today. I think they've been pretty substantive. We've given some level of flexibility, and I think that we have at least an outline of a plan to move forward. A great deal of this naturally now would depend upon the work group to iron out much of the discussion and comments that Dr. Saban and others have raised, reference to how that practicum would be going forward. But we are going to hopefully be able to meet the time frame that you suggested, because again, the current recommendation is not what we have on the table. And we want to make sure that this recommendation is reflected in the final outcome, especially before we go to our final comprehensive plan, which is in December. But in order to meet that, we need to make sure that we get everything back in terms of the draft and have people comment on it in a timely fashion. Okay,
Mr. Manco has his hand up.
sure, Joe.
Just to get some additional clarity, when the memo will land with Dr. Chaudhary and MSDE, these are, from what I understand, these are recommendations that we are making.
Right.
It's ultimately up to them to decide whether they accept the proposed changes that we have included in the memo, whether they want to convene the work group or not. These are all decisions that are left up to them, and they'll move forward. Or are these, I guess, requirements, or what is the expectation for when the memo lands with MSD?
Well, I think this is part of the consultation that he is going through, and that's what we're providing. He's consulting with us, which is an ongoing requirement, I guess. But as you've just indicated, ultimately they have to decide what they're going to put forth in terms of the regulation. We're just he's just consulting with us on this. This is why it is important for us to get those things back in a timely fashion, because without that, whatever absence any feedback or any suggested changes, then the train is left the station with or without us.
I would just add that the convening of the work group, I think is certainly within the AIB's authority to ask this group to convene. They were required to meet under the blueprint law, and they didn't. So I think that an MSDE would be part of that work group. So the work group piece of it is something that the AIB can and I think wants to move forward with. And so that's not something that is necessarily voluntary, although obviously, it's a voluntary group that we're asking to convene. But in terms of the actual regulations and what they choose to, whether they choose to modify the regulations or not, consistent with the recommendations is their recommendations. Yeah.
And then would it be the AIB that convenes the work group, or is that a group that's convened by MSD?
So the statute sort of asks them to convene themselves, which may be part of why it didn't happen. So I think let me talk with the MSDE staff and the other staff and see how we want to organize it. But the AIB could certainly convene it if that made the most sense.
And then in terms of
What happened?
Oh,
Go on, Joe.
Membership of the work group, and who would be brought together to discuss this. That's something that's left to the staff of the AIB in order to determine and discuss, and then they report back.
So what the law originally required that representatives from the teacher preparation programs be part of the work group. So it didn't get into the detail of exactly who would be on the work group. So all things being equal, I'd be inclined to reach out to the deans. There's a group, and they could recommend however many folks they would like from the public, the 4-year public and private programs. And also, I think we want to make sure the community colleges are represented, as they have to make sure that their associate in teaching programs are aligned with the new requirements.
Thank you.
Anything else, Joe? Okay, thank you. All right, there anything else, Rachel, we need to cover on this subject today?
Yeah,
Okay,
I just wanted to make a point. It's a point, not necessarily something for the written response. And Rachel kind of hit on it just a few minutes ago in talking about the community colleges. And my point or my comment is about the pathways to teacher licensure. And we have a population that we really haven't talked about too much, and that's the adult career changer who decides, after they've already had a career or whatever, that they want to become a teacher. And these folks have, an array or diverse experiences and education and skills and so forth. And so their pathway to teacher licensure is not the same as somebody is a young person or whatever coming to school for the first time. And I just want to, it's not something that I want to make sure of, but it's just something that I want to make a point of and either encourage MSBE, I'm sorry, or PASTAB. I hope I said that right. I always mess up the acronyms. And maybe this is something for the work group to just be mindful to make sure that when we're going through these regulations and we're changing things and hopefully improving things, that we are not in any way limiting those institutions that serve those adult career changers. And that's usually primarily community colleges and those universities who target the adult learner, because they are very instrumental in creating or helping to create pools of qualified teachers.
I think that's a good point, and we need to be mindful of the balance that we have to create here, because we want to make certain that there's a certain level of rigor in ensuring that we have the quality of teachers for our system, but we also are facing a real challenge in terms of the quantity of teachers that are potentially out there. So we have to balance things that may restrict that potentially against that rigor. And so we need to constantly keep that in mind. And this is one point, because ultimately for us to get the number of teachers that we need, we're going to have to ramp that up, as well as other attempts to get more people into the profession. And so we have to constantly balance that, because we can't make this happen without a higher number of teachers and a greater quality of teachers in our system. And that's one path that we don't want to unduly restrict.
So I'll add,
Okay.
I'll add something around that to the memo.
Okay, if there's no other question, we have to now go into, I think, executive session. And I don't have the language here. Rachel,
Would you like me to read it?
Yeah.
So would be a motion to adjourn to closed session in accordance with the Open Meetings Act for an administrative function.
Okay, I so move.
So
The
moved.
second to the, or second. Okay. Before we do that, we will also indicate very clearly that we will adjourn the meeting from the closed session today.
Yeah.
And so all in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Bye.
Opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Take 5 minutes and we'll go into closed session. Thank you.